Christmas time again, and that probably means I'm making something for somebody. This year, it's a lamp made out of an old bottle. The base of the lamp is the beginning of the project. I'm using this fairly rough piece of walnut, which has some serious bows in it, so I cut it to short lengths at the table saw first. That way I don't have to do quite as much jointing to get it flat. It then goes back to the table saw to get the opposite sides nice and flat and square to one another. I'm making these pieces pretty much as wide as the rough stock will allow me to have a nice beefy base on the lamp. Miters are used to assemble these 4 pieces into the base, and I just put a screw right into the table saw sled to use as a stop, make sure I got them all exactly the right length. Here I'm setting the depth for the rabbet that will hold this piece of brass for the top of the base of the lamp. It's pretty thin stuff, so a router lift is about the only way to get that right. And a push block is an absolute necessity for a short block like this. But if you're careful and take your time, you can get a nice flush fit between the brass and the wood. There's not going to be any shear stress on these miters. It's going to be sitting on a table. So I think just glue and a good strong web clamp is going to be enough to hold this thing together for the duration. I wanted the heavier look of a thicker frame, but I don't want the bottle to sit all the way down inside it. So I need a little block to serve as a stand for the bottle to get it up closer to the top of the frame. Once it's dry, a hand plane cleans up the glue and leaves everything really smooth. I'm laying out my brass pretty carefully. The lines are pretty much exactly what I want the final dimensions to be, so I'm checking it for square even before I start cutting. Tin snips do a great job of cutting this thin brass sheet, but they don't leave the greatest edge on it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to clamp my brass between these blocks of wood. That lets me do 2 things. It lets me clean up the edge and sand it down exactly to the line. I needed a hole for the cord to get into the lamp assembly, but I didn't want to drill a full round hole. I wanted sort of a half moon. So I took a Forstner bit and drilled into the side of the base. For decoration, I put a 45-degree chamfer along the outside edge of this frame. And because it's a mitered frame, it's all long grain. I don't have any end to worry about tearing out here on the router table. I still took a couple of shallow passes, though. With everything cut to its final shape, it's time to start laying out the brass for all of the holes. I need 2 for switches and 1 for this behemoth, this bottle. The hole for this thing needs to be exact. I mean exactly right. So I used the calipers to determine the width of it, cut it in half, and then used that to set my circle cutting jig. I cut a test hole in this plywood. It's a snug fit, but the brass is just a little bit pliable too, so it should work out pretty well. Yes, you can cut metal with a circle cutting jig as long as it's soft like brass. These 2 side holes are for the switches that'll work the main bulb and the Christmas lights that go in the middle. The switch holes ultimately have to be rectangular, and I suppose you could bust out a Dremel or something, but the file actually works pretty well. And we do need some pilot holes in the corners and along the edges to hold this brass down with number 2 screws. I need holes in the bottle, and that means I got to drill through glass somehow. That's what this Dremel rig is for. Honestly, the only complicated part of this is figuring out how to clamp down a slippery round glass bottle and mustering the patience not to crank on this Dremel drill press while it drills through this thick stuff. I also need a wiring channel through the base of the lamp. I waited till after I drilled the bottle to route this so that I'm sure it would be in the right place. I stole most of the parts for the top socket of this lamp from another $5 lamp I got at Walmart. That gave me the threaded rod and this nice chrome piece, which I could put through a hole in the actual bottle cap and bolt together with this nice big washer to reinforce that thin cap. It needs to be pretty tight, but it is plastic, so be careful. There's a lamp cord wire running up the center of this lamp for the main socket, and then these Christmas lights have to get fed down in there, kind of wrapping around it so that they'll distribute themselves around the bottle. You can then just shove the cord through your topper, and I wire tied my Christmas lights to the main lamp cord just to be safe. Because of the temperature in my shop, my finishing options are limited. Shellac will cure and will still cure pretty quickly, so this allows me to build up a couple of coats that I can then rub out with steel wool and maybe top coat with some wax. Final assembly starts with threading the power wire through the socket assembly and then screwing it to the top of the bottle. The lamp socket then goes in, observing the proper hot and neutral color codes while you're at it. Moving down to the bottom of the lamp, we can start the power wiring. I have to add a little bit to the one side of the Christmas lights to get it to the other side of the base. So I'm going to solder and use hot shrink tubing to make sure this is all nice and safe. Finally, we can mount the lamp in place. So set it there, slide the copper down over top of it, and then shove a whole lot of hot glue underneath the bottom. You got to move quickly here because you don't have any margin for error getting that copper to line up in the rabbet that you cut. Wiring the switches will definitely require some extra hands. I have a thing called a third hand that's commonly used for soldering that I just blue taped to the side of the bottle to help me out. Once they're wired up, the switches just pop into place in the brass. Be careful because it is a little soft. Final construction step is to add some felt to the bottom of the lamp. This covers up all of the wiring and makes sure that it won't scratch the top of the nightstand it's sitting on. I scored it with a razor knife just to mark it, but then you have to cut it with scissors. Hot glue will hold it in place. I like to tack the corners and then go back and fill in the edges. Well, I think it needs a bigger shade, but other than that, it came out great, and it's not that difficult of a project as long as you just kind of take your time, especially when working with the brass, because once you take it away, you can't put it back. As always, questions or comments, feel free to leave them down below. If any of you are looking for a last-minute Christmas gift idea for me, a YouTube subscription is cheap and fits in a stocking. In all seriousness, Merry Christmas and Happy New Year from everybody here at Miscellaneous Matt. I'll see you in January, and in the meantime, stay safe, YouTube.